Shiv, there has been an escalation with the west of Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine, whether it's Ivano-Franko or Lviv. They are routinely now being targeted, and Russia has sent out a very clear, if not sinister, warning to Ukraine. But does this warning include NATO countries too?
Gaurav, this is a very specific threat, but that's been issued as part of a military conference by the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu personally yesterday, and it basically it does not include targets in those NATO countries, because that would obviously mean total war between Russia and NATO. What he's saying is that the NATO assets, the NATO vehicles, transport, container trucks, etc., that are actually bringing all this equipment, all this military hardware, all this ammunition across the border from Poland into Ukraine will be fair game. He says Russia will destroy these NATO vehicles bringing in these weapons, which is a significant escalation, because so far, these convoys and supply lines have not been targeted. Some of the depots have been targeted, which contain these NATO-supplied weapons, but the actual convoys bringing the weapons in have not been targeted so far. So what Russia is saying is things have become so bad. We are acknowledging, the subtext is Russia is acknowledging that it is as a result of these weapons that Ukraine has been able to inflict so much damage on the Russian units and forces, and therefore Russia is going to hit those supply lines, the jugular that is supplying this lifeblood into Ukraine in the form of NATO weapons, whether it is Javelin, whether it is Stinger, whether it is other things of that kind. They're basically saying, you are now a legitimate target and we will hit you. Obviously, the implications are huge. If you hit NATO vehicles, is Russia expecting people to believe that NATO will not hit back? That's why it's so alarming, Gaurav.
General, how do you explain this? 71 days into this conflict, Russia has repeatedly warned that they will target supply lines. But it's only now that some railway lines, power stations, certain roads, certain depots have been targeted. Why after more than 2 months? Is this lack of intelligence? Is this lack of capabilities? Or is this trying to bring some kind of a negotiation and now saying that we want to remain on top of the escalation ladder, which perhaps Russia isn't so far?
The world seems to think that the Russians are on the back foot. Slowly and steadily you realize that the Russians are consolidating, especially on the eastern front as also on the southern front, and they haven't been firing much on the western part of Ukraine. But with the way the Western allies are going about equipping the Ukrainians, already $8 billion given, another $12 billion of military aid being promised to it, I think the Russians are giving a clear signal that please, for God's sake, don't mess around. It's between us and Ukraine. If the Ukrainians are going to do what they are wanting to do, primarily because the Russians have suffered with javelins and stingers, there's no denying the fact on that score. Definitely the Russians would want the escalation ladders to be built in such a way that the West realizes it's not worth it. The West has made it very clear, no boots on ground. So there are no NATO boots on ground. It's the Ukrainians themselves with the equipment supplied by the West, which is they're fighting the Russians. And rightly so, I think whoever be in place of Russia, the Russians are now going to target free for all. So there are no safe passages. Now there is nothing that can be said is safe. Everything. Now the Russians are at war within Ukraine. They aren't targeting beyond Ukraine. So all these logistics and military vehicles carrying NATO weaponry will be targeted by the Russians with a view that the war ends and the Russians are able to at least achieve the military aim, if not the political aim.